There is a moment in every royal family's history when a decision so quiet, so carefully worded, and so deliberately measured sends shockwaves across the entire world. This is one of those moments. Two children, both born into a family that carries the weight of centuries of tradition, found themselves at the center of a battle that was never supposed to be theirs. Their names are Archie and Lilibet. Their grandfather is King Charles III. And the question of what they are called, what they are officially recognized as, has torn through the British royal family in a way that no war of words, no tell-all interview, and no documentary series ever fully managed to explain. This is the story of how a 100-year-old law, a king's quiet power, and one family's impossible choices collided to create the most talked-about royal ruling of the modern era. It started long before anyone outside the palace walls knew there was even a problem. When Meghan Markle was still pregnant with her first child in early 2019, conversations were already happening behind closed doors at Buckingham Palace that would shape the future of two children who had not yet been born. These were not casual conversations. They were deliberate, structured, and deeply political in the way that only royal family decisions can be. The question being asked was straightforward on the surface, but enormously complicated underneath. Would Harry and Meghan's baby be a prince or a princess? And the answer, it turned out, depended on laws written over 100 years ago by a king who could never have imagined the family he was legislating for. To understand how this story began, you have to go back to 1917. King George V, the great-great-grandfather of both Prince William and Prince Harry, issued a legal document that would govern royal titles for generations to come. That document is called a letters patent. It is an open declaration from the monarch, carrying the full weight of royal law, and it sets out in very precise language exactly who gets to be called a prince or a princess. What King George V decided in 1917 was this: only the children and grandchildren of the reigning monarch would automatically receive those titles. Great-grandchildren would not. It was a deliberate move to slim down the number of royals carrying formal titles, to keep the monarchy clean, focused, and manageable. For most of the 20th century, this rule worked exactly as it was designed to. It was not controversial. It was simply the law. But then came the 21st century, and with it a set of circumstances that nobody in 1917 had accounted for. When Prince William married Catherine Middleton in 2011, Queen Elizabeth II made a quiet but significant change. She issued her own letters patent specifically for William and Catherine's children, ensuring that all of their children, not just the eldest, would be known as princes and princesses. She did this because William was destined to be king, and it was considered appropriate and dignified that all of his children carry royal titles equally. That decision affected Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis, and nobody questioned it. It was simply the right thing to do. What nobody publicly noticed at the time, or if they noticed, nobody said out loud, was that this created a very visible difference within the same generation of royal grandchildren. William's children would all be princes and princesses. Harry's children, under the old 1917 rules, would not be, at least not yet. Because Harry was not in the direct line of succession in the same way William was, and because his children would be great-grandchildren of the Queen rather than grandchildren of the reigning monarch, they would not automatically hold prince or princess titles at birth. They could only receive those titles once Harry's father, Charles, became king. Until then, they would simply be children of a duke and duchess, with no formal royal designation. When Archie Harrison Mountbatten-Windsor was born on May 6, 2019, the world expected an announcement. Everyone assumed the baby would be given a royal title. Instead, there was silence. The palace confirmed that Archie would simply be known as Archie, not a prince, not an earl, not anything official. His parents made a public statement saying they had chosen not to use a courtesy title at that time. At first, many took this at face value. It seemed like Harry and Meghan's well-documented desire to give their son a more normal life, free from the weight of royal expectation. That explanation made sense to most people, but behind closed doors, a very different conversation had already taken place. What Meghan would later reveal to the world, in her explosive sit-down interview with Oprah Winfrey in March 2021, was that the decision about Archie's title had not simply been about privacy or a desire for normalcy. It was about conversations that had taken place while she was still pregnant, conversations in which she claimed members of the royal family had indicated that Archie would not be getting the title of prince, not at birth and not later. She described these discussions as something that troubled her deeply, particularly in the context of what else was being said during those conversations. Meghan told Oprah that there had been talk she found painful and shocking about how dark the baby's skin might be. She stopped short of naming names, but the implication was clear enough, and the world heard it loud and clear. The palace did not respond directly to all of Meghan's claims, but royal commentators and legal experts were quick to point out the factual side of the title question. Yes, Archie was not automatically a prince at birth, but that was not because anyone had changed the rules for him specifically. It was because the 1917 letters patent had never been altered to include great-grandchildren of the sovereign. He was always going to have to wait until his grandfather became king. That was the law as it had always existed. The distinction that palace insiders and royal experts drew was this: nobody had taken a title away from Archie. He simply hadn't been entitled to one yet under the existing legal framework. But that explanation, while technically accurate, did not fully address Meghan's concern. Because what she was also describing, and this part is crucial, was a conversation about whether the letters patent would be changed specifically to prevent Archie from ever getting a title, even once Charles became king. In other words, she was saying that there had been a deliberate discussion about whether the monarch would intervene proactively to block her son's path to a title. That was something entirely different from simply inheriting a centuries-old rule. That was an active decision. And whether it happened exactly the way Meghan described it, or whether there were misunderstandings, or whether the full picture was more complicated than any one account could capture, it planted a question in the public mind that would not go away. After the Oprah interview, the conversation about Archie's title shifted permanently. What had once been a relatively obscure point of royal protocol became a flashpoint in one of the most divisive family dramas the British monarchy had ever seen. People took sides. Some believed Meghan completely and saw the title issue as evidence of a family that had treated her and Harry differently from the start. Others believed the palace's explanation and felt that Meghan had oversimplified or misrepresented a legal reality that was actually quite straightforward. And there were those who fell somewhere in the middle, who believed that both things could be true at once, that the 1917 rule was a real rule, and that there had also been internal discussions about using that rule in a way that was specifically targeted at the Sussex children. The summer of 2022 brought a significant moment that seemed, on the surface, to offer some resolution. Queen Elizabeth II died on September 8, 2022, and in that instant the legal landscape for Archie and Lilibet changed completely. Their grandfather was now the king. Under the 1917 letters patent, as the grandchildren of the reigning monarch, they were now automatically entitled to the titles of prince and princess, as well as the HRH designation. It happened by operation of law, not by any deliberate decision anyone had to make. The entitlement was simply there as soon as Charles took the throne. But for 6 months, nothing was announced publicly. The titles existed in law, but no one made a formal declaration. No updated record appeared on the palace website. No official confirmation came from Buckingham Palace or from the Sussex team. People noticed. Royal commentators raised the question repeatedly. Were the titles going to be formally recognized? Was Charles going to issue a new letters patent to block them, as he had always had the power to do? Was Harry going to decline them on behalf of his children, as he had initially seemed to do when Archie was born? The silence stretched on, and with it came all the speculation that silence inevitably invites. Then in March 2023 the answer came, though it came in an unexpected way. Buckingham Palace quietly updated its official website. The names changed. Where there had once been no titles, there was now a formal listing, Prince Archie of Sussex and Princess Lilibet of Sussex. And the announcement came not from some unilateral palace decision, but at the request of the Sussex family themselves. Harry and Meghan had asked for the formal recognition. They had, in the end, chosen the titles for their children. What made this so interesting to royal observers was the context. Harry had spent years talking publicly about the burden of royal life. He and Meghan had left the UK in large part to escape the weight of royal expectations and obligations. They had written books and produced documentaries exploring how the institution had damaged them. And yet, when the moment came, when the entitlement was there, and the choice was theirs to make, they chose to formalize the titles. They chose to have their children officially recognized as a prince and a princess. It was a decision that said more than any interview ever could about how complicated the relationship between this family and their royal identity really was. Lilibet Diana, the younger child, had a separate and also quietly significant moment in 2023. It was announced that she had already been christened, privately, in California, using her full royal title. It was the first time that Meghan and Harry had publicly used the title of princess for their daughter, and the announcement also included confirmation of her baptism, which had taken place earlier in the month. Both children were now officially, formally, and publicly recognized as members of the royal family carrying prince and princess titles. The controversy that had begun in a palace room while Meghan was still pregnant seemed, at last, to have found its resolution. Except that it hadn't, because a title once given can also be taken away. And King Charles III, the man who had watched all of this unfold while saying almost nothing publicly, still held a power that no one in the Sussex household could fully ignore. As monarch, he had the same authority that King George V had exercised in 1917, and that Queen Elizabeth II had exercised in 2012. He could issue a new letters patent at any time. He could rewrite the rules, and reports began to surface, gradually, persistently, that those in the palace were not done thinking about the question of what Archie and Lilibet's place in the royal structure should really look like. The signs were subtle at first. Charles had spoken for years, even before he became king, about his vision for a slimmed-down monarchy. He believed that too many working royals created confusion, expense, and dilution of purpose. He had watched his mother's monarchy expand in ways he thought were not always beneficial, and he had made clear that he intended to run a tighter ship. The coronation in May 2023 offered the clearest visual signal of this intention. Where Queen Elizabeth II's jubilees had featured large numbers of royals on the Buckingham Palace balcony, Charles's coronation gathered only a small handful of core working members for that traditional public moment. The message was unmistakable to anyone paying attention. The inner circle was shrinking. Harry and Meghan were not part of that inner circle. They had not been working royals since 2020. They lived in California, thousands of miles from the palace. They had no official royal duties, no formal engagements, no regular contact with the institution. In that sense, whatever titles Archie and Lilibet carried, they were not titles connected to any actual royal function. They were, in the language of the palace, courtesy titles held by private individuals living a private life in another country. And that reality raised a question that nobody had fully answered yet. What was the point of the titles, and what would happen to them if Charles decided to act? That question would not stay theoretical for much longer, because the king had already shown in the clearest possible terms that he was willing to use his power over royal titles when he believed the situation demanded it. And the example he set, the precedent that made everything that followed feel suddenly very real and very close, involved someone much closer to home than Harry or Meghan. It involved his own brother. And what happened to that brother changed the entire calculus of what royal titles mean in the modern era, and how quickly a king can act when his mind is made up. Before the story of Archie and Lilibet's titles can be fully understood, you have to look at what King Charles did to his own brother, because that decision, made at the end of 2025, changed the way the entire world looked at the power a British monarch holds over the titles of his family members. It was the moment the royal family stopped being theoretical and started being a very concrete demonstration of just how far a king could go when he decided the time had come. Prince Andrew, the Duke of York, had been at the center of scandal for years. His association with the convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein had haunted him since the story first broke publicly in 2019. He had given a disastrous television interview that year that was widely considered one of the worst moments in modern royal history, an interview so damaging that it effectively ended his public life within the family. He stepped back from royal duties and retreated largely from public view. But the questions never went away. The legal proceedings in the United States continued. The scrutiny never stopped, and the palace's patience with the situation wore thinner and thinner over time. Then, in the autumn of 2025, things reached a breaking point. Fresh scrutiny over Andrew's ties to Epstein became too much for the institution to absorb quietly. King Charles moved quickly and decisively. On October 30, 2025, Buckingham Palace announced that the monarch had begun the formal process of stripping Prince Andrew of all of his titles and honors, including the title of prince itself, and the HRH designation he had carried his entire life. Days later, on November 3, 2025, it became official. A letters patent was issued and published in the Gazette, the United Kingdom's official public record. The entry was simple, legal, and devastating in its directness. It stated that King Charles had declared that Andrew Mountbatten Windsor would no longer be entitled to hold or enjoy the style, title, or attribute of Royal Highness, and the titular dignity of Prince. With that single document, a man born royal ceased to be one. Prince Andrew, who had been the Duke of York, was gone. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor remained. He was also removed from his long-time royal residence at Royal Lodge. The king had used his royal prerogative, the legal authority that allows the monarch to manage titles and honors without needing any act of parliament, to erase the royal identity of his own brother. No vote, no debate, no legislation, just a document, a signature, and a publication in the official record. The significance of this action cannot be overstated when considering what it might mean for Archie and Lilibet, because what Charles demonstrated with his brother was not just a willingness to act. It was a roadmap. He showed the world exactly how it would be done if he ever decided to do the same thing to anyone else. A letters patent, issued under the royal prerogative, published in the Gazette. The process was clean, efficient, and legally unassailable, and royal commentators across the United Kingdom immediately noted the obvious parallel. If Charles could do it to Andrew, a man born royal and carrying his titles for over 60 years, the same power very clearly extended to anyone else in the family. Royal commentator Richard Fitzwilliams had explained the mechanics of this in plain terms earlier in 2025. He pointed out that unlike a peerage, a title such as Duke or Earl, which is a matter of parliamentary law and requires an act of parliament to remove, the HRH designation is something the monarch can take away unilaterally. Archie and Lilibet received their HRH status under the 1917 letters patent of King George V, but that patent can be overridden by a new one. The king has the authority to issue a document that specifically removes or restricts the titles of any named individual, regardless of what any previous patent established. The question was never whether Charles could do it. The question was whether he would. Reports of Charles's long-held desire for a slimmed-down monarchy had been circulating for years. The idea was simple in principle. The monarchy should be a working institution, not an extended family club. Titles and all the privileges that come with them, security arrangements, formal recognition, access to royal resources, should belong to those who actually perform royal duties on behalf of the crown and the country. Those who live private lives, particularly those who have actively chosen to step away from the institution, should not carry the full weight of royal designation as if they were still part of the working family. Harry and Meghan had chosen exactly that path. They had left. They had written about leaving. They had spoken about leaving. They had built careers, businesses, and an entire public identity around the fact that they had left. And yet their children, by virtue of the legal rules that existed, carried titles that formally connected them to the very institution their parents had so publicly walked away from. Archie and Lilibet had never done anything wrong. They were children. They had no voice in any of this. But the question of what their titles represented, and who those titles were really for, was something that people inside and outside the palace were beginning to ask more loudly. There was another layer to all of this that rarely got discussed openly, but that everyone involved understood. The Sussex family had reported to palace insiders and to journalists close to the story that they intended to include Archie and Lilibet's royal titles in the children's official passports. They also reportedly believed, and had indicated privately, that they wanted their children to retain the option of becoming working royals at some future point. That desire, that aspiration to keep the door open even while living thousands of miles away in California, was something that many inside the palace viewed with deep skepticism. How could children who had never lived in the United Kingdom, who were being raised entirely outside the institution, who had no connection to the day-to-day reality of royal life, realistically become working members of the monarchy at some future point? The skepticism was not entirely without sympathy. People close to Charles acknowledged that he had genuine affection for his grandchildren, whatever the complications of his relationship with their parents. He had met Archie and Lilibet only a handful of times since Harry and Meghan left for California. A particularly notable private meeting took place in July 2026, when both children were brought to Highgrove House for a private visit with their grandfather, their first meeting with him in over 4 years. That meeting was private. No cameras, no official statements, no public record beyond what the press could piece together from distant observation. But it happened. And the fact that it happened quietly, without any formal announcement or public display, said something about the nature of the relationship, warm perhaps, but careful, and not without its complications. Meanwhile, the formal question of what Archie and Lilibet's titles meant in practical terms continued to hang in the air. Every few months, a new wave of reporting would revive the debate. Some outlets pushed sensational stories claiming Charles had already stripped the children of their titles, that a secret decree had been issued, that the Sussex family had discovered the news through the media rather than through any direct communication from the palace. These stories circulated widely, particularly on social media platforms where royal news travels fast and verification often travels slow. But journalists and royal correspondents who actually covered the palace consistently found no credible evidence to support the most extreme versions of these claims. What was true, genuinely, verifiably true, was that Charles had not made any public declaration altering the children's titles as of the time this story was being documented. The palace's official website still listed Prince Archie of Sussex and Princess Lilibet of Sussex. No letters patent had been published in the Gazette removing their designations. No official announcement had been made. The titles remained. But the power to change that also remained, held by one man, who was watching, waiting, and thinking through every implication of a decision that would have consequences far beyond the immediate family. What Charles was weighing was not simple. On one hand, removing the titles of two young children who had never chosen their circumstances would be an extraordinarily controversial act. It would invite comparisons to the worst moments in royal family history, moments of perceived cruelty, pettiness, and institutional self-protection at the expense of innocent individuals. It would hand Harry and Meghan a narrative they would never have to work very hard to promote. The palace punishing children for the choices of their parents. The public sympathy would not fall on the side of the crown in that scenario. Even people who were deeply skeptical of Harry and Meghan's public campaigns against the royal family would find it difficult to support a decision that appeared to target children. On the other hand, letting the situation drift indefinitely was its own kind of problem. Every year that passed with no clear resolution was another year in which the question was left open. The media kept speculating, and the palace appeared unable or unwilling to make the kind of clear structural decisions that Charles had promised to be the hallmark of his reign. He had stripped Andrew of everything. He had been decisive, clear, and unapologetic about it. If his vision for the monarchy was genuinely one of clarity and purpose, then what did it mean that two children living in California with no connection to royal duties continued to carry formal titles and HRH designations? There was also the question of what Archie and Lilibet themselves would eventually want. They were still very young. Archie turned 6 in 2025. Lilibet turned 4. They were not at an age where anyone was asking them what they thought about any of this, and it would be years before they were. But the decisions being made now, or not being made, would shape the choices available to them when they were old enough to have opinions of their own. If they grew up with titles and later chose not to use them, that was one thing. If they grew up in a world where the titles had already been taken, that was something entirely different. It was a fork in the road that no one could take back once the choice was made. Complicated everything further was the state of the relationship between Charles and Harry. By 2025 and into 2026, the father and son who had once been genuinely close, who had shared a bond forged through grief, through the loss of Diana, through years of shared public life, were navigating a distance that was not merely geographical. Harry had published a memoir that went further into the private world of the royal family than any living member had ever dared to go. He had described conversations, confrontations, and moments of vulnerability that Charles almost certainly would have preferred to remain private. He had made claims about his family that the palace had neither confirmed nor denied in any systematic way, choosing instead a policy of dignified silence that sometimes looked like strength and sometimes looked like avoidance. And yet, despite all of it, the private meeting at Highgrove happened. Charles and his grandchildren sat together quietly, away from the cameras, and whatever passed between them in that private space was something no journalist or commentator could fully account for. The grandfather existed alongside the king. The man existed alongside the institution. And inside that tension, between what was personal and what was royal, between what felt right and what was politically correct, between love and precedent, the question of two children's titles was slowly but surely moving toward a moment of reckoning. because something had shifted, something in the way Charles was approaching the final architecture of his reign. He was not a young man. His health had commanded public attention. The pace of royal life had asked a great deal of him, and the decisions he made now, the structural choices about who was in and who was out, who was royal in name alone and who was royal in reality, would shape the monarchy that William would inherit. Charles was not just thinking about himself. He was thinking about the institution. He was thinking about what he would hand to his son and heir. And that changed the calculation in ways that nobody outside the palace walls could fully measure. The question was no longer simply whether Charles had the power to act. He had demonstrated, with the cold clarity of a published document in the Gazette, that he absolutely did. The question was whether and when he would choose to use that power and what shape his decision would take. And as the months moved forward and the conversations in the palace corridors continued, and the speculation in the press continued, the story was moving not backward but forward, toward a conclusion that was still being written. The clearest way to understand where the story of Archie and Lilibet's title stands is to look at what it costs everyone involved. Not in money, not in political capital alone, but in something harder to measure and easier to forget in the noise of speculation and reporting. It costs something human. It costs something that gets lost every time the conversation shrinks down to legal documents and royal protocol and constitutional precedents. Because at the center of this story there are two children, and whatever happens next will happen to them long before they are old enough to fully understand it. But to get to where things stand now, you have to retrace the final stages of how this became the conversation it became. How a debate about a 108-year-old royal decree turned into one of the defining tensions of the modern British monarchy, and why the answer that Charles eventually gives to the title question will define not just the Sussex family but the institution itself. After the events of 2025, after Andrew lost everything, after the palace machinery demonstrated exactly how efficiently it could remove the royal identity of someone born into the family, the Sussex camp went quiet in a way that felt deliberate. Harry and Meghan had built their public profile on the power of speaking. The book, the documentary, the interviews, the podcast, the website, every element of their post-royal life had centered on communication, on telling their version of events to as wide an audience as possible. So when they went quiet, people noticed. And the quiet had a particular texture to it. It was not the quiet of a family at peace. It was the quiet of people who understood that the ground beneath them had shifted, and who were watching carefully to see what came next. Inside the palace, the machine of royal administration continued doing what it always does. Meetings took place. Legal advice was sought and considered. The question of the Sussex children's titles was one item among many on an agenda that covered everything from foreign state visits to charitable foundation reviews to the practical realities of managing a centuries-old institution in the middle of the 21st century. Charles did not operate in isolation. He was advised by the Lord Chamberlain, by his private secretaries, by legal counsel who understood constitutional law in fine detail. Any decision about the children's titles would pass through all of those layers before it became anything final. What royal commentators consistently noted during this period was that the king had a window, a natural, logical moment, in which a decision about the titles could be made in a way that would attract the least controversy. If Charles was ever going to act, doing so during a period of quiet, when there was no immediate news cycle drama around the Sussex family, would be strategically cleaner than acting in the middle of some public confrontation. The Andrew example had been instructive in this regard as well. When that decision came, it came at a moment of fresh and urgent public pressure. Charles had not let the story fester or grow larger. He had moved swiftly and cleanly, issued the document, and let the legal record speak for itself. But the Archie and Lilibet situation was different in one fundamental way that the Andrew situation was not. Andrew was an adult with a lifetime of choices behind him. The decisions that led to his title being stripped were his own decisions, made over decades of adult life. Whatever one thought of the justice or the harshness of the outcome, there was a logical line connecting his behavior to the consequence. Archie and Lilibet had no such line. They were children. They had done nothing. Any decision to strip their titles would be a decision made entirely about their parents and their parents' choices, and visited upon them without their knowledge or consent. That moral reality sat at the heart of why this decision was so difficult, and why it had not yet been made. There were voices within the broader royal conversation, commentators, constitutional scholars, even some members of parliament, who argued that the current arrangement was itself a kind of cruelty in slow motion. To leave two children formally designated as a prince and a princess, officially listed on the royal family's public records, and then never actually give them any of the real substance of what that designation is supposed to mean? No security, no royal duties, no connection to the institution, no relationship with the family beyond the occasional private visit, was to leave them holding a title that was in many respects empty. It looked real on paper. It meant very little in life. Others argued the opposite with equal force. The titles were real. They connected Archie and Lilibet to their heritage, to a family they were still technically part of, to an identity that was not simply their parents' story but their own story too. Removing those titles because of what their parents had done, because of a family breakdown that Harry and Meghan had described publicly and in enormous detail, would be a final severing. It would make official what had so far remained unofficial. And it would send a message to those children, and to the world watching, that the royal family had decided their grandfather's grandchildren were not welcome. The weight of that message was something Charles appeared to take seriously. By all accounts available through royal reporters and palace sources, he was not approaching this as a simple administrative matter. He was approaching it as something that would define a significant part of his legacy. The decisions a king makes about his own family speak to who he is beyond the throne. They speak to the human being inside the institution. And Charles had made enough hard decisions in his life, had lived through enough complicated family history, to know that some of the choices that look cleanest in the moment leave the deepest marks over time. Harry and Meghan's public posture during this period continued to be one of carefully maintained ambiguity. They had not formally renounced the titles for their children. They had not publicly called for the titles to be confirmed or protected. They were using the titles in the children's passports, according to reports from sources close to the family, suggesting that however much they had spoken about wanting a more private life, they had not entirely given up on the formal connection to the institution. That in itself was a choice with meaning. It suggested that whatever their public narrative, they understood that the titles represented something real, something protective, something valuable, something they were not ready to let go of entirely. The Sussex family had also continued to make occasional decisions about how much of their children's lives to share publicly, and those decisions were themselves a kind of communication. The Christmas card of 2024 showed the family together, but with the children's faces partially obscured, as it had been for years. When Meghan launched her lifestyle website as ever in 2025, Lilibet appeared briefly in content on the site, a milestone for a family that had been almost entirely invisible in terms of its youngest members. These small signals were noticed and analyzed by the same community of royal watchers who had been following every development in this story for years. What had become clear by the middle of 2026, when the most recent chapter of this story was still being written, was that the question of Archie and Lilibet's titles had become something larger than just a family argument about protocol. It had become a test case for the kind of monarchy that Charles intended to leave behind. A test case for what the institution stood for, what it valued, and how it treated the most complicated relationships within its own family tree. A king who stripped titles from children would be seen by many as petty and vindictive, regardless of his actual motivations. A king who left everything exactly as it would be seen by others as indecisive and unable to fully implement the slimmed-down vision he had always championed. There may be a third path. Royal commentators had begun to suggest that Charles might choose to issue a clarifying document, not one that explicitly strips titles, but one that defines more precisely what those titles mean in practice. A document that acknowledges Archie and Lilibet as members of the royal family by birth and by blood, but that clearly delineates their status as non-working members with no formal royal obligations and no official connection to the crown's public duties. Something that says, in legal language, that the titles are theirs but that the institution is not. That the door is neither fully open nor fully closed. Whether that kind of middle ground would satisfy anyone is another question entirely. Harry and Meghan would likely view any kind of restriction or clarification as a diminishment, a further step toward removing their children from a family they had never entirely left. Those who supported a clean break would see a middle ground document as another example of the palace refusing to make the hard decisions. And those who cared most about the children themselves would probably just want clarity, any kind of clarity, over the endless uncertainty that had surrounded this question since before either child was born. The real story of Archie and Lilibet's titles is not, in the end, a story about law. It is not really a story about protocol, or letters patent, or the 1917 decree of King George V, or the royal prerogative, or any of the other legal frameworks that provide its structure. Those are the bones of the story. But the flesh and blood of it, the part that makes it matter, the part that makes people all over the world watch and argue and care about what happens next, is something much older and much more universal than any royal rule. It is a story about a family that broke apart and has not been able to put itself back together. It is a story about two parents who made choices that they believed were right, and who are now watching those choices ripple outward in ways they could not entirely control or predict. It is a story about a grandfather who loves his grandchildren and also happens to be the King of England, and who must make decisions that are not only personal but institutional, not only immediate but historical. And it is a story about two children, Archie and Lilibet, who have no say in any of it, who are growing up in California, going to school, living ordinary days, not knowing that millions of people across the world are watching and waiting to find out what they will officially be called. Whatever happens next, whether Charles acts or chooses not to act, whether Harry and Meghan respond publicly or go quiet, whether the palace issues another carefully worded document or stays silent as it has stayed silent before, the children at the center of this story will eventually grow up. They will be old enough to read about it, to understand what was said about them, what was decided about them, what was argued and speculated and legally debated before they were even old enough to form their own opinions. And they will make their own choices about who they are and what their connection to the royal family means to them. That day is still years away, but it is coming. And whatever title Archie and Lilibet carry when it arrives, Prince and Princess, or simply the two children of Harry and Meghan, will say something not just about them, but about the family they came from, the institution that shaped them from a distance, and the grandfather who held the power to write the final chapter of this particular story and spent years deciding whether and how to use it. The conversation that started in a palace room in 2019, before Archie was even born, has never fully ended. It has evolved, deepened, complicated itself with new events and new revelations and new silences. It has been shaped by laws written a century ago and by decisions made only months ago. It involves a king trying to build a legacy, a family trying to find its footing, and two small children who carry names that mean something to millions of people who have never met them. The ruling, whatever form it eventually takes, will be more than a legal document. It will be a statement about what the royal family believes it is, what it is for, and who belongs to it. That is why the world has been watching since before it started, and that is why it has not looked away yet.